As a Christian, it's quite easy to acknowledge premarital sex as a sin because God said so. What about anyone else? Do they have any reason to abide by this rule? I mean, after all, Christians don't even abide by this rule. 70% of the US identify as Christian, but 3% are virgins at marriage. It's a small number. I believe God does not make arbitrary rules. By that, I mean the commandments of God that He expects us to follow always have a secular explanation. I want to preface that statement with the distinction between the judicial law of the Old Testament and moral law. Moral laws are holy, just, and unchanging. Their purpose is to promote welfare of those who obey. The value of the laws is obvious by reason and common sense. The culmination of these rules make up the framework of morality. After all, without God, there is no morality. I'll cover that in another video. Judicial law, on the other hand, were specifically given for the culture and the place of the Israelites. It includes everything from ceremonial practices to the consequences for theft during that day and age. These laws are largely forgotten by Christians as they no longer fit the context for which they were written. Okay, that's enough theocracy. What's the secular argument for chastity? Well, objectively speaking, hookup culture has done serious damage to our society. Although sexual liberation has successfully happened, the outcomes of the revolution have largely been a failure. The outcomes are a reality most people are not willing to acknowledge. For example, STD rates among young adults are at a historic high. More sex partners results in higher rates of divorce, lower quality marriages, and worse life outcomes. If a woman has sex with more than 20 guys, the likelihood of her divorce is more than 80%. More traditional marriages and gender roles is positively statistically linked with better marriages and better life outcomes. The divorce rate skyrocketed in the 70s at the start of the sexual revolution, and at the turn of the century, it began to fall slightly. Well, that coincided with a drastic dip of marriage rates. Millennials have basically given up on marriage entirely. I'll end up producing a video on modern age attempts to fill this gap as well. The Me Too movement has been culturally relevant for the better part of 3 years. The problem with harassment stems from how our culture treats sex. Our shift in attitude on sex over the past half century has hurt women the most. Marriage is a hell of a deal for women. It guarantees them committed emotional and financial support out of a man. It's ironic how the efforts of the feminists who actively undermine the nuclear family have done the most damage to women. For men, marriage civilizes them. It teaches them to be protectors of a family and be selfless providers. A society that treats sex as a physical transaction of pleasure has a very hard time making the argument that the casting couch of Hollywood is bad. If a woman feels like trading her body for an acting career, that's her business and power to her. If you disagree, you're a slut-shaming misogynist. The acknowledgement must be made that sex has meaning above the physical transaction. There's a high degree of emotional intimacy involved in sex. If this were not the case, then casting couches, sexual misconduct, rape, all of these things would cease to be hideous acts of evil. Sex does not work outside of a committed relationship. There are reasons the traditional relationship is that of committed monogamy. It has been proven throughout history to be the most effective. As soon as you deviate from the norm, you are doing so at your own peril. Sure, there certainly are exceptions to the rule, but the onus is on that individual to prove that they are the exception and not the rule. More than likely, they are not. Have you ever been told that the myth that 1 in 5 women in university are raped? That isn't quite true. The figure is closer to 10% of women who at one point attended university either had an attempted rape or had been raped within their life. That's still a very high number. The problem has to do primarily with the behavior of young people. College-age kids are stupid and do stupid things. They overconsume alcohol and other drugs and do even more stupid things. Almost all date rapes are a consequence of intoxication. While feminists argue men, especially college-age boys, act like pigs, their solution is poor. Therefore, women should also act like pigs? If we really want to reduce sexual misconduct on college campuses, we might want to take a closer look at the alcoholic party culture. No rational person can deny that abstinence is the wisest path to take. Objectively speaking, abstinence is the more favorable outcome. For starters, it nearly eliminates fatherlessness. Never married single mothers outnumber single widows and divorcees combined. Kids who grow up without a father are orders of magnitude more likely to abuse drugs, commit crimes, be impoverished, drop out of school, and have mental disorders, compared to kids with a two-parent household. Divorce rates of abstinent couples are much lower than couples who cohabitate. If sex were safe for marriage, abortions would be down 86%. Does safe sex outside of marriage exist at all? I'd argue no. Sex with someone you are not wholly committed to raising a child with is fundamentally reckless. You can mitigate the risks with various forms of birth control, but that's like wearing a seatbelt while driving drunk. The reason sex exists at all is for procreation, the very thing people outside of marriage tend to evade. The only safe course of action is not to do it at all. How do you know if you and your partner are wholly committed to raising a child together? The only solid answer is a public, legally binding display of commitment that we call marriage. Marriage was created exactly for this reason. It was and remains to be an institution for which we can properly raise children. Many people say abstinence before marriage is unrealistic. It certainly isn't easy to forgo immediate pleasure for the promise of long-term happiness. Again, in another video, I'll discuss how discipline is the only way to achieve freedom. If you are currently with someone and the thought of not having sex scares you, it might be because orgasms are masking the deeper problems within the relationship. If your relationship falls apart as soon as sex disappears, maybe you shouldn't be in that relationship. I challenge you. Stop having sex, find someone you love, get married, resume having plenty of sex, stay married, be faithful. You'll be better off for it.